During a dinner with his wife, the waitress approaches and shows her childhood photo, and the millionaire freezes. The same photo of his daughter who disappeared 21 years ago. The crystal chandelier above cast dancing shadows across the mahogany table as Richard Callahan signed the final page of what would become his largest acquisition to date, $37 million in pharmaceutical patents, a deal that had taken 18 months to orchestrate, the kind of victory that should have felt triumphant, but somehow left him hollow. "Congratulations, Mr. Callahan," said Patterson, his lawyer, extending a manicured hand. "This puts Callahan Industries in a league of its own." Richard nodded, forcing the practiced smile that had served him well in boardrooms for the past 2 decades. At 54, he'd built an empire that most men could only dream of, yet every success felt like another brick in a wall he'd constructed to keep the pain at bay. Le Bernardin hummed with the quiet sophistication that money could buy. Crystal clinked against china. Conversations flowed in hushed tones, and the city's elite celebrated their victories over truffle-infused delicacies. This was Richard's world now, a world where every detail was controlled, where chaos couldn't penetrate. "The Chateau Margaux, sir." The sommelier appeared beside him, bottle poised. "Please." Richard watched the deep red wine pool in his glass, thinking absently of how Margaret would criticize his choice. "Too ostentatious," she'd say, then order something twice as expensive just to prove a point. The waiter, Patterson had mentioned his name, moved efficiently between tables, but Richard's attention was drawn to the young woman approaching with their appetizers. She moved with careful precision, though something in her posture suggested she was fighting nerves. Grace, that's what her name tag read, mid-20s, with striking amber eyes and dark hair pulled back in a neat bun that couldn't quite contain a few rebellious strands. There was something familiar about her features, though Richard couldn't place it. "The tasting menu for the table," she said, her voice carrying a slight tremor as she set down the first course. Her hands shook almost imperceptibly as she reached for the wine bottle. "Allow me," Richard said gently, noticing her distress. That's when it happened. Grace's foot caught the edge of the thick Persian rug, sending her stumbling forward. The silver tray clattered to the floor, but that wasn't what made Richard's blood freeze. It was the thin gold chain that had been hidden beneath her uniform. Now broken, its clasp having given way during her fall, the pendant skittered across the marble floor, coming to rest near Richard's Italian leather shoes. Without thinking, he bent to retrieve it, his fingers closing around the delicate locket. "Oh God, I'm so sorry." Grace dropped to her knees, frantically gathering the scattered silverware, her face flushed with embarrassment. "Please, I can pay for any damage." But Richard wasn't listening. The locket had opened in his palm, revealing a photograph so small it could barely be called such. Yet every detail was crystal clear, burned into his memory like a brand. A little girl, no more than 6 years old, stood beside a tall, elegantly dressed man. They were both smiling, the kind of unguarded, genuine joy that Richard hadn't felt in 21 years. Behind them, an ornate fountain captured in miniature detail, its carved angels seeming to dance in frozen celebration. Richard's hands began to tremble. The fountain, he'd commissioned that fountain himself, had it installed in the gardens of their Connecticut estate. Emily had loved playing around it, had begged him daily to throw pennies and make wishes. The estate he'd had demolished after the night that changed everything. Sir, are you all right?" Grace's voice seemed to come from underwater. Richard forced himself to look up at her, really look at her. The amber eyes. Not just any amber eyes, but that specific golden brown that had haunted his dreams. The small scar on her chin, barely visible now but unmistakable. The way she tilted her head slightly to the left when concentrating. Just like, "Emily," he whispered, the name escaping his lips like a prayer. Grace froze. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" Richard struggled to regain his composure, his mind reeling. "Your necklace. The photograph." Grace's eyes widened with something that might have been panic. She reached for the locket with desperate urgency. That's nothing important. An old family photo." But as she took it from his trembling hands, Richard caught her wrist gently. "The fountain in the picture. Do you know where it was taken?" Grace's voice caught. "My Aunt Helen said it was somewhere in Connecticut. She said my parents used to take me there before. She trailed off, something flickering in her eyes. A shadow of a memory, perhaps. Richard released her wrist, his heart hammering against his ribs. Emily would be 27 now, the same age as Grace, the same height, the same delicate bone structure that had come from Margaret's side of the family. And those eyes, those were definitely his mother's eyes. "Mr. Callahan," Patterson's voice cut through the fog. "Is everything all right?" "Fine," Richard managed, though his voice sounded strange even to his own ears. "Just fine." Grace had backed away, clutching the broken chain to her chest. Other staff members had appeared to help clean up the mess, but Richard barely noticed them. His entire world had narrowed to this young woman who might, God, let it be true, might be his daughter. "I should get back to work," Grace said quietly, avoiding his gaze. "Again, I'm so sorry for the disruption." "Grace," Richard called as she turned to leave. She looked back, and for just a moment, he saw something in her expression that took him back 21 years. The same curious intelligence, the same unconscious grace that had made Emily special from the day she was born. "Yes, sir? Do you have children of your own?" The question seemed to surprise her. "No, sir. It's just me and my Aunt Helen. Has been for as long as I can remember. As long as she could remember." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. What if Emily didn't remember? What if whoever had taken her had made her forget? Grace disappeared into the kitchen, leaving Richard staring at the spot where she'd stood. Patterson was saying something about market projections, but the words washed over him meaninglessly. All Richard could think about was a little girl in a yellow sundress, chasing butterflies around an ornate fountain, begging her daddy to push her higher on the swing set. The same little girl who had been stolen from her bed on a rainy October night 21 years ago. His phone buzzed against the table. Margaret, probably wondering when he'd be home to their mausoleum of a marriage, where they moved around each other like ghosts, held together only by shared grief and social expectations. Richard stared at the phone, remembering how Margaret had changed after Emily's disappearance, how she'd thrown herself into charity work and social climbing with manic intensity, as if staying busy enough could make the pain disappear, how she'd insisted on moving out of their Connecticut home within 6 months, claiming the memories were too much to bear, how she'd stopped talking about Emily altogether, as if their daughter had never existed, but Richard had never stopped looking, never stopped hoping. "And now, I need to go," he said abruptly, standing so quickly that his chair toppled backward. "But the contracts..." "Tomorrow," Richard said, already reaching for his coat. "We'll finish tomorrow." As he strode toward the exit, Richard's eyes swept the restaurant one more time, searching for another glimpse of Grace, but she was nowhere to be seen, already swallowed up by the kitchen's controlled chaos. 21 years of searching, of false leads and dead ends, of private investigators who'd taken his money and delivered nothing but disappointment. 21 years of keeping Emily's bedroom exactly as she'd left it, of lighting candles on her birthday and wondering if she was still alive somewhere. And now, in the last place he'd expected to find answers, a broken chain had fallen at his feet like a gift from God. Richard stepped out into the crisp October air. The same month Emily had disappeared all those years ago. The city hummed around him, oblivious to the earthquake that had just shifted the foundations of his world. His daughter might be alive. His Emily might be alive. Richard barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Grace's face, the amber eyes, the delicate scar, the way she'd clutched that broken locket like it contained her whole world. By 5 a.m., he'd given up on rest altogether and found himself in his study, surrounded by dusty boxes he hadn't opened in years. Emily's files, police reports, FBI documentation, private investigator records, 21 years of desperate searching condensed into cardboard containers that smelled of old paper and faded hope. His hands shook as he pulled out a manila folder marked Age Progression Photos. There she was. Computer-generated images showing what Emily might look like at 10, 15, 20, 25. The latest one, commissioned just 2 years ago, showed a young woman with familiar amber eyes and dark hair, a woman who looked remarkably like Grace. "Jesus Christ," he whispered to the empty room. Richard's phone buzzed. Margaret, probably wondering why he hadn't come to bed, Their marriage had become one of silent ships passing in the night. She in her pharmaceutical haze, he buried in work that never quite filled the Emily-shaped hole in his chest. He ignored the call and pulled up the restaurant's employee records instead. Hacking into their system wasn't exactly legal, but Richard had learned long ago that money could buy access to almost anything. Within an hour, he had what he needed. Grace Whitmore, age 27, hired 6 months ago, previous employment at a small diner in Albany. Before that, various service jobs scattered across upstate New York. No permanent address until recently. No credit history before age 18. No birth certificate on file. Just a social security number that led to a paper trail so thin it was practically transparent. Everything about Grace Whitmore screamed fabricated identity. By 8 a.m., Richard was parked across from Grace's apartment building in Queens. It was a modest pre-war structure, the kind of place where working people lived paycheck to paycheck. Nothing like the sprawling estates where Emily should have grown up. He didn't have to wait long. At 8:30, Grace emerged wearing jeans and a wool coat, a canvas bag slung over her shoulder. In the morning light, the resemblance to his lost daughter was even more striking. She had Emily's purposeful stride, the same unconscious elegance that had made a 6-year-old look like a tiny princess. Richard followed at a distance as Grace walked 6 blocks to a small neighborhood market. Through the window, he watched her carefully selecting vegetables, checking prices with the methodical attention of someone who counted every dollar. Emily had been raised with every privilege money could buy. The idea of his daughter having to budget for groceries made his chest tighten with rage and grief. When Grace left the market, she didn't head toward the subway. Instead, she walked to a small park and sat on a bench beneath an old oak tree. She pulled out a sketchbook and began drawing, her movements fluid and sure. Emily had loved to draw. Richard remembered finding her artwork taped to the refrigerator, crayon masterpieces of their family, always with an enormous yellow sun beaming down on stick figures holding hands. He'd saved every single one. From his position 50 yards away, Richard pulled out his phone and zoomed in on Grace's sketch. Even from a distance, he could see the careful attention to detail, the natural talent that spoke of years of practice, just like Emily, who'd been drawing since she could hold a crayon. 20 minutes later, Grace closed the sketchbook and checked her phone. As she stood to leave, something fell from her bag, a small piece of paper that the October breeze immediately claimed. Without thinking, Richard moved forward. The paper had caught against the bench leg. Richard retrieved it, expecting to find a grocery list or a phone number. Instead, he found himself staring at a child's drawing rendered in careful detail. A house with a red door, surrounded by enormous flowers. In the corner, written in a child's shaky handwriting, Emily's house. Richard's knees nearly buckled. He clutched the paper, his vision blurring. Emily had drawn this exact picture dozens of times. Their Connecticut home with the red front door and Margaret's prized garden. But how could Grace have this drawing unless... "Excuse me, did you drop this?" Richard spun around to find Grace standing a few feet away, having apparently forgotten something and returned. She was staring at the paper in his hands, her face gone completely white. Richard's voice caught. "Yes, I saw it fall from your bag. I thought you might want it back." Grace reached for the drawing with trembling hands. "Thank you, it's nothing important. Something I found in some old things. Emily's house," Richard read aloud, watching Grace's reaction carefully. She flinched as if he'd struck her. My Aunt Helen told me I drew that when I was little, before my parents." She trailed off, wrapping her arms around herself defensively. "Before your parents what?" "Before they gave me up." The words came out bitter and sharp. "Helen said I was too much trouble, too demanding. They couldn't handle a difficult child, so they just left me with her." Richard felt something crack inside his chest. 21 years of wondering what had happened to his daughter. And she'd been told that her parents, that he and Margaret, had abandoned her voluntarily. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. "Grace," he said gently, "what if I told you that might not be true?" She backed away from him, suspicion clouding her features. "What do you mean? Who are you really? Why are you following me?" Richard realized his mistake too late. In his desperation to connect with her, he'd revealed himself. "I'm not following you. I just happened to be in the area." "Bullshit!" Grace's voice turned hard. "You were at the restaurant last night. asking weird questions about my necklace. Now you're here, in my neighborhood, asking about a drawing I made 20 years ago. That's not a coincidence. She was right, of course, and smart. Just like Emily had been smart, always asking questions that adults couldn't answer, always seeing through their careful deflections. You want to know the truth, Grace continued, her amber eyes flashing with anger. My parents dumped me like I was garbage. Helen rescued me from foster care when I was 6, gave me a home when no one else wanted me. So whatever sick game you're playing, your parents didn't abandon you, Richard said quietly. They searched for you every single day for 21 years. Grace went very still. What did you say? Richard pulled out his phone and showed her one of the age progression photos. Her name was Emily. She was 6 years old when she was taken from her bedroom on October 15th, 2003. She had amber eyes and a small scar on her chin from falling off her bike when she was 4. Grace's hand flew unconsciously to the scar on her own chin. You're crazy. You're absolutely crazy. Am I? Richard stepped closer, his voice urgent. Think, Grace. What's your earliest clear memory? Grace faltered, confusion replacing anger. I remember Helen teaching me to read. I remember moving a lot when I was little. She said it was because of her work. Nothing before age 6. No memories of a red door. A fountain. A dog named Thor. Grace stumbled backward as if he'd slapped her. How could you possibly know about Thor? Because Thor was Emily's dog. A golden retriever who slept at the foot of her bed every night until the night she disappeared. The color drained completely from Grace's face. She pressed her palms against her temples, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow. This isn't possible. Helen would have told me. She wouldn't lie to me about something like this. Wouldn't she? Richard pulled up another photo on his phone. The Callahan family portrait taken just weeks before Emily's disappearance. Look at this picture, Grace. Really look at it. Grace stared at the screen, her expression cycling through disbelief, recognition, and something that might have been terror. The photograph showed Richard and Margaret in their prime, both beaming as they flanked a beautiful 6-year-old girl with amber eyes and dark curls. The fountain in your locket, Richard continued, his voice gentle but relentless. It was in our backyard in Connecticut. You used to throw pennies in it and make wishes. Your favorite wish was for a pony named Buttercup. Grace made a small, wounded sound. Stop. Please stop. You had a pink bedroom with glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling. You were afraid of thunderstorms, so I'd sit with you until they passed, and we'd count the seconds between lightning and thunder. You called it our storm game. No. Grace was backing away now, tears streaming down her face. Helen is my family. She's the only family I've ever had. She saved me. Grace. My name is Grace, she shouted, then turned and ran. Richard watched her flee, his heart breaking all over again. 21 years he'd waited for this moment, dreamed of finding his daughter. In all his fantasies, he'd imagined tears of joy, embraces, instant recognition. He'd never considered that Emily might not want to be found, that she might prefer the lie she'd been living to the truth that would shatter everything she believed about herself. As Grace disappeared around the corner, Richard realized the hardest part of getting his daughter back wouldn't be finding her. It would be convincing her that she'd never really been lost at all. Grace's hands were still trembling 3 days later as she tied her apron in the restaurant's back room. She'd called in sick for 2 shifts, claiming food poisoning. But the truth was, she couldn't stop thinking about the man with the haunted eyes and his impossible story. Your parents didn't abandon you. They searched for you every single day for 21 years. The words echoed in her mind like a broken record. She'd spent 48 hours trying to convince herself he was just some delusional rich guy, maybe someone who'd lost his own daughter and was projecting onto random strangers. But those details he'd known. Thor, the storm game, the fountain. How could he possibly know things that felt like fragments of dreams she'd been having her whole life? Grace, honey, you look pale, said Maria, the head waitress, as Grace emerged from the back room. You sure you're feeling better? Just tired, Grace managed, forcing a smile. I'll be fine. But she wasn't fine. For 3 days, she'd been having flashes of memory that didn't fit with anything Helen had ever told her. Images of a golden dog, a man's voice singing lullabies, the smell of gardenias in a sun-dappled garden. Each fragment felt real, but Helen had always insisted that Grace's early memories were unreliable, confused by trauma and displacement. "You were so young when your parents left you," Helen would say whenever Grace asked questions. Children's minds protect them by forgetting painful things. "It's better this way, sweetheart. Better to focus on the family you have now." Grace had accepted that explanation for 21 years, but now doubt was creeping in like water through a cracked foundation. The lunch rush passed in a blur of orders and forced smiles. Grace found herself scanning the dining room between tables, half expecting to see Richard Callahan's intense blue eyes watching her from some shadowy corner. But he didn't appear, and by 3 o'clock, she'd almost convinced herself he'd given up his crazy crusade. Then she saw him. He was seated at table 12, the same corner booth where he'd been 3 nights ago when her world had tilted off its axis. But this time, he wasn't with business associates. He sat alone, studying the menu with the kind of careful attention that suggested he wasn't really reading it at all. Grace's first instinct was to hide in the kitchen until someone else could serve him. But something, maybe curiosity, maybe the stubborn streak Helen always complained about, made her square her shoulders and walk over. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Can I start you with something to drink?" Richard looked up, and Grace saw something flicker across his features. Relief, maybe, or hope. "Just coffee, please, Black." She nodded and started to turn away, but his voice stopped her. "Grace, wait. Please, I can't do this here," she said quietly, glancing around the busy restaurant. "I'm working. I know I'm not here to upset you, He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I wanted to apologize for the other day. I handled that badly. You followed me home." "Yes, I did, and I'm sorry. That was wrong." Richard's voice carried genuine remorse. "But Grace, if there's even a chance that what I told you is true..." "There isn't." The words came out sharper than she'd intended. "Look, Mr. Callahan, I don't know what you're going through, but I'm not your daughter. I'm not Emily. I'm Grace Whitmore. I've lived with my Aunt Helen since I was 6, and my parents gave me up because they couldn't handle me. That's my life. That's my truth. What if it's not?" Grace set down the water glass she'd been holding before her hands could betray their shaking. "What do you want from me? Just give me 5 minutes. Let me show you something." Against her better judgment, Grace found herself nodding. 1 minute, and only because you're a customer." Richard reached into his jacket and pulled out a small photo album. "These are pictures of Emily, of my daughter." Grace reluctantly looked down at the open album. The first photo showed a baby with dark hair and serious eyes. The next, a toddler in a yellow dress, laughing as she chased soap bubbles across a green lawn. Then a slightly older girl building sandcastles, riding a tricycle, painting at an easel with intense concentration. "She loved art," Richard said quietly. "Always had a paintbrush or crayon in her hand. She'd draw for hours, lost in her own little world." Grace's throat tightened. She'd been drawing obsessively since childhood, creating elaborate sketches that Helen always praised but never quite understood. Lots of kids like art. Turn the page. The next photo made Grace's breath catch. It showed a little girl with unmistakably familiar amber eyes. Sitting beside a golden retriever on a porch swing, the dog's head was resting in the child's lap, and both looked utterly content. "That's Thor," Richard said. "Emily named him after the god of thunder because she said he was brave enough to protect her from storms." Grace stared at the photo, her mind reeling. She'd been having dreams about a golden dog for as long as she could remember. Always the same dream, where she was small and safe and loved, curled up next to warm fur while rain pattered against windows. "This doesn't prove anything," she whispered. But even she could hear the doubt creeping into her voice. Richard turned another page. This photo showed the little girl standing in front of an ornate fountain, arms outstretched as if trying to catch the spray of water. She was laughing, her face tilted toward the sun, and she looked exactly like you, Richard said softly, as if reading her thoughts. "She looked exactly like you do now." Grace's hand moved unconsciously to the broken locket she wore beneath her uniform. The photo hidden inside seemed to burn against her skin. "I need to get back to work. Grace, please don't." She backed away from the table, the album still open between them. "Please don't do this to me." But Richard was already reaching for something else. Another photo. This one more recent. This is an age progression image. What the FBI thinks Emily would look like now, at 27. Grace couldn't stop herself from looking. The computer-generated face staring back at her could have been her reflection. The same bone structure, the same eyes, even the same slightly crooked smile that Helen always said made her look mischievous. No, Grace breathed. This isn't possible. What's your earliest clear memory? Richard asked gently. Grace's mind scrambled for something concrete, something real. Helen teaching me to read. We were in a small apartment with yellow walls, and she had these flashcards. Before that, try to remember before that. Grace closed her eyes, and suddenly she was somewhere else entirely. A room with pale pink walls and stars on the ceiling that glowed in the dark. A man's voice singing softly, something about guardian angels and sweet dreams. The smell of gardenias drifting through an open window. Her eyes snapped open. I have to go. Grace, please. I said I have to go. She turned and fled toward the kitchen, leaving Richard sitting alone with his photos and his impossible claims. But she could feel his eyes following her. And worse, she could feel the cracks spreading through the foundation of everything she'd believed about herself. In the kitchen's relative privacy, Grace leaned against the wall and tried to catch her breath. Her phone buzzed with a text from Helen. Working late tonight, sweetheart. Don't wait up. Love you. Grace stared at the message, remembering Helen's face when she'd asked about the drawing of Emily's house. The way her aunt's expression had tightened. Just for a moment, before she'd dismissed it as childhood nonsense. What if it wasn't nonsense? What if those fragments of memory weren't dreams or fantasies, but actual recollections of a life that had been stolen from her? When Grace finally returned to the dining room 20 minutes later, Table 12 was empty. In Richard's place, she found a business card tucked under his untouched coffee cup. On the back, written in careful handwriting, was a phone number and a single line. When you're ready for the truth, call me. Grace slipped the card into her pocket, her mind churning with questions she was afraid to ask and answers she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. But as she cleared the table, one thought kept echoing in her head. What if he's right? What if everything I know about my life is a lie? The questions followed her home that night, whispered to her in the dark as she lay sleepless in her narrow bed. And for the first time in 21 years, Grace Whitmore began to wonder if she might actually be someone else entirely. Helen Whitmore's hands shook as she poured her third cup of coffee that morning, the ceramic mug clattering against the saucer. Grace had left for work an hour ago, but the conversation from the night before still echoed in the small Queen's apartment like a death knell. Aunt Helen, do you ever think about my real parents? I mean, really think about them. Why would you want to think about people who abandoned you, sweetheart? I don't know. It's just, I've been having these dreams lately, about a dog and a fountain, and Helen had cut her off then, redirecting the conversation to safer territory. Grace's job, the weather, anything but the past. But she'd seen the questions forming in Grace's amber eyes. The same intelligent curiosity that had made Emily Callahan so dangerous to keep all those years ago. The burner phone hidden in Helen's bedroom dresser had been silent for 3 months. But now she pulled it out with trembling fingers. Janet's number was still programmed in, the only contact in a device that existed solely for emergencies. Janet answered on the second ring. Helen, Christ, you're using the emergency phone. What's wrong? Someone's asking questions about Grace. Helen's voice came out as a whisper. Though she was alone in the apartment, a man approached her at work, showing her pictures, asking about her childhood. What kind of pictures? I don't know exactly, but Grace came home shaken up. She's been having memory flashes, asking about her parents. Janet, I think... Helen's voice cracked. I think someone knows. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Helen wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Janet spoke, her voice heavy with exhaustion. I was wondering when this day would come. What do you mean? I mean, 21 years is a long time to live with a secret like this. Helen, I've been waiting for it to catch up with us. Helen sank into her worn recliner, the same chair where she'd rocked 6-year-old Emily to sleep during those first terrifying weeks, back when the little girl had cried for her mommy and daddy every night. When Helen had told herself this was temporary, just until the heat died down. Tell me again why we did this, Helen said quietly. Janet's bitter laugh carried across the phone line. You really want to relive that nightmare? Fine. Margaret Callahan was screwing her husband's business partner while playing the perfect society wife. I caught them together in the pool house when I was supposed to be off duty. When I threatened to tell Richard, she had me fired and blacklisted from every decent household in Connecticut. Helen remembered that phone call, Janet sobbing with rage and humiliation. Her 20-year career in domestic service destroyed by one moment of inconvenient honesty. She cost me everything, Helen. My reputation, my livelihood, my dignity, all to protect her precious image. Janet's voice turned cold. So I decided to take something precious from her. You said it would just be for a few weeks, Helen whispered. You said once Richard found out about the affair, once their marriage imploded, we'd return Emily, and they'd be too busy destroying each other to ask questions. That was the plan. But you never told Richard about the affair, because you begged me not to. Janet's voice rose. You fell in love with that little girl from day one. When I came to take her back after 2 weeks, you threatened to turn us both in rather than give her up. Helen closed her eyes, remembering those early days with Emily. The child had been traumatized, confused, crying constantly for parents who weren't coming, but gradually, Helen's patient care had won her over. Emily had started calling her Aunt Helen, had begun to smile again, to laugh. Helen had told herself she was healing the child's wounds, giving her the love and attention that busy, wealthy parents never could. She'd convinced herself that Emily was better off, that taking her hadn't been kidnapping but rescue. I gave her a good life, Helen said defensively. I loved her more than those people ever did. Those people never stopped looking for her. Helen, Richard Callahan spent millions on private investigators, offered rewards, kept the case active with the FBI. That doesn't sound like parents who didn't care. Then why hasn't he found us before now? Because you were smart about it, all those moves. The fake documents, keeping her isolated from other kids who might ask questions. You created Grace Whitmore so thoroughly that Emily Callahan disappeared. Helen had become an expert at reinvention over the years. New cities, new identities, always cash transactions. Always staying under the radar, she'd homeschooled Grace until high school, told neighbors they were hiding from an abusive ex-husband, cultivated the image of a protective aunt keeping her traumatized niece safe from the world. But now someone's figured it out, Helen said. Was it Callahan himself? Grace didn't say, but probably she described him as older, wealthy, intense, said he knew things about her childhood that he shouldn't know. Janet was quiet for a long moment. Helen, we need to talk about what comes next. What do you mean? I mean, we've been living on borrowed time for 21 years. If Richard Callahan has found Grace, it's only a matter of time before the rest of it comes out. The false documents, the identities we created, everything. Helen's grip tightened on the phone. Are you saying we should run? I'm saying we should consider it. One more move, one more fresh start. Grace is an adult now. She can make her own choices about whether to go with you. She'd never leave. This is her home, her life. She has a job, friends. She has a job waiting tables and a handful of acquaintances. Janet cut her off. That's not a life, Helen. That's existence. Maybe it's time to let her have what was stolen from her. What was stolen from her? Helen's voice turned sharp. I saved her. I gave her love, stability, a mother who actually cared about her well-being. The Callahans were too busy with their social calendar and business deals to pay attention to their own daughter. Is that what you tell yourself to sleep at night? The question hit like a slap. Helen had indeed told herself exactly that for 21 years, creating an elaborate justification for the unjustifiable. Emily had been neglected, unloved, better off with someone who would cherish her. It was a story that had grown more detailed and more convincing with each telling. Grace is happy, Helen said weakly. Is she really? Because from where I sit, you've raised a young woman who's afraid of her own shadow, who can't form lasting relationships, who jumps at every unexpected sound. You've kept her so isolated from the world that she doesn't even know who she really is. Helen thought about Grace's dreams, the nightmares that had plagued her for years, images of storms and golden dogs and faceless people calling her name. Helen had always dismissed them as anxiety, the product of an overactive imagination. But what if they were something else entirely? The guilt is eating me alive, Helen, Janet continued. I'm 68 years old, And I wake up every morning thinking about that little girl crying for her parents. I'm tired of running from what we did. What are you saying? I'm saying maybe it's time to tell the truth. Helen shot to her feet. The phone pressed tight against her ear. Are you insane? We'd go to prison. Both of us for the rest of our lives. Maybe that's what we deserve. What about Grace? What about what this would do to her? What about what we've already done to her? She's been living a lie for 21 years, Helen. Don't you think she deserves to know who she really is? Helen walked to the window and peered down at the street below, half expecting to see police cars or private investigators lurking in the shadows. Instead, she saw ordinary people living ordinary lives, unaware that one of the country's most famous unsolved kidnapping cases was playing out just above their heads. I can't lose her, Helen whispered. She's all I have. Then you should have thought of that before you convinced me to take her in the first place. The line went dead, leaving Helen alone with the crushing weight of 21 years' worth of lies. She sank back into her chair and pulled out the photo album she kept hidden beneath her bed. Pictures of Grace growing up, smiling and laughing and trusting the woman who'd stolen her childhood. In every photo, Grace looked happy, but now Helen found herself wondering if happiness built on a foundation of lies could ever really be genuine. If love based on deception could ever truly heal the wounds it had caused. Outside, storm clouds gathered over Queens, and Helen couldn't shake the feeling that after 21 years of running from the truth, it was finally about to catch up with them all. Richard stood in the doorway of his penthouse study at 2 a.m, watching Margaret through the security camera feed from their living room. She was curled up on the Italian leather sofa, a half-empty bottle of Xanax on the coffee table beside her, staring at the muted television with glassy eyes. This had become her nightly ritual over the past decade, pills and wine, until she achieved the chemical numbness that passed for peace in their hollow marriage. But tonight felt different. Tonight, Richard could no longer pretend that their shared grief was the only secret rotting between them. He found her exactly where the cameras had shown her, still in the designer dress she'd worn to some charity luncheon earlier that day. Her perfectly styled blonde hair had come loose from its pins, and mascara stained her cheeks in dark rivulets. Margaret. She didn't look up from the television, where some late-night infomercial promised instant happiness for 3 easy payments of $19.99. You're home late, again. We need to talk. Do we? Margaret's voice carried the slurred precision of someone fighting to sound sober. Because I was rather enjoying the silence. Richard walked to the bar and poured himself 3 fingers of scotch, his hands steadier than they'd been in days. The amber liquid reminded him of Grace's eyes, Emily's eyes, and the resemblance hit him like a physical blow. I found her, Margaret. The television remote slipped from Margaret's fingers, clattering to the marble floor. For a moment, the only sound was the mindless chatter of the infomercial. Found who? But her voice had changed, gone sharp beneath the pharmaceutical haze. Emily, our daughter, she's alive. Margaret's laugh was brittle as breaking glass. Richard, darling, you can't keep doing this to yourself. How many false leads have there been? How many young women have you convinced yourself were Emily? This isn't a false lead. Richard pulled out his phone and showed her the photo he'd taken of Grace outside the restaurant. Look at her, Margaret. Really look. Margaret's face went white as she stared at the screen. Her hands began to shake so violently that Richard thought she might drop the phone. Where did you take this? At Le Bernardin. She's a waitress there. Her name is Grace Whitmore. She's 27 years old, and she has a scar on her chin from falling off her bike when she was 4, just like Emily. Stop. Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. She doesn't remember us. Someone convinced her that we abandoned her, that we gave her up because she was too difficult. Can you imagine that? Our little girl believing for 21 years that we didn't want her. Margaret stood abruptly, swaying slightly as the pills and alcohol hit her equilibrium. I need another drink. You've had enough. Don't you dare tell me what I've had enough of. The words exploded out of her with unexpected venom. You have no idea what I've had enough of. Richard set down his scotch and studied his wife's face. In the harsh light of the crystal chandelier, he could see every line that grief and guilt had carved into her features over the past 2 decades. But there was something else there now, something that looked almost like panic. Margaret, what aren't you telling me? Nothing. There's nothing to tell. She moved toward the bar, but Richard caught her wrist. You're lying. Let go of me. You know something about Emily's disappearance. You've always known something. Margaret jerked away from him, backing toward the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a glittering view of Manhattan. You're being paranoid. The stress of this new lead is making you. Is Grace really Emily? The question hung in the air between them like a blade. Margaret's face cycled through a dozen emotions. Denial, fear, calculation, and finally, something that looked like relief. Yes, she whispered. The simple word hit Richard like a physical blow. He'd known it, felt it in his bones from the moment Grace's locket had fallen at his feet. But hearing Margaret confirm it made his knees weak. How long have you known? Margaret's silence stretched long enough that Richard wondered if she'd retreat back into her chemical fortress. Then, in a voice barely audible above the city's distant hum, she spoke. 15 years. Richard's scotch glass slipped from his numb fingers, shattering against the marble floor. 15 years you've known where our daughter was for 15 years. Richard, you don't understand. I don't understand. His voice rose to a roar. I don't understand how you could know where Emily was and not tell me. I don't understand how you could watch me torture myself with hope and false leads while our daughter was alive and within reach. Because it was my fault. Margaret's confession tore out of her like a scream. Emily's kidnapping was my fault. And if she came home, she'd find out what I did, and you'd both hate me forever. Richard stared at his wife, the woman he'd shared a bed with for 25 years, and realized he was looking at a stranger. What did you do? Margaret collapsed back onto the sofa, her carefully constructed facade crumbling like ancient plaster. I was having an affair with David Patterson, your business partner, your friend. It had been going on for 2 years. The name hit Richard like a sucker punch. David Patterson, the man who'd stood beside him at Emily's memorial service, who'd helped organize search efforts, who'd offered comfort and support through the darkest period of Richard's life. Janet Holloway found us together in the pool house, Margaret continued, her voice flat and emotionless. She was supposed to be off duty, but she'd forgotten something and came back. She saw us. Together. Richard's mind raced back to those final weeks before Emily's disappearance. Janet had been acting strangely, more formal than usual, avoiding eye contact. He'd attributed it to stress. The household had been chaotic with Margaret's increased social commitments and his own business pressures. Janet threatened to tell you, unless I paid her off. I couldn't let her destroy our marriage, destroy everything we'd built, so I had her fired instead. Made up some story about missing jewelry to blacklist her from other positions. And then Emily disappeared. 3 weeks later, Margaret's voice broke. At first, I thought it was random, a terrible coincidence. But when no ransom demand came, when the investigation went nowhere, I hired my own private detective. Richard felt sick, while he'd been working with the FBI, following every lead they provided. Margaret had been conducting a parallel investigation, keeping secrets that might have saved their daughter years of stolen life. My investigator found her when she was 12, living with a woman named Helen Whitmore in a small town in Pennsylvania. Helen was Janet's sister. Jesus Christ. Richard sank into a chair, his legs unable to support him. Janet took Emily for revenge. At first, yes, but the plan was supposed to be temporary, just long enough to make us suffer. Then she'd return Emily and disappear. But Helen, Margaret's voice trailed off. Helen what? Helen couldn't have children. She was desperate for a family, and when Janet brought Emily to her, she fell in love. She convinced Janet to let her keep Emily permanently. Richard thought about Grace, the way she moved through the world with careful caution, as if expecting disappointment at every turn. The isolation that clung to her like a second skin, the wariness in her amber eyes. Why didn't you tell me? He asked. When you found her, why didn't you bring her home? Margaret's laugh was hollow, because by then, Emily believed Helen was her only family. She'd been told we abandoned her, that we were terrible parents who didn't want her. If I brought her home, if the truth came out, she'd learn that her kidnapping was because of my affair. She'd know that her childhood was stolen because I couldn't keep my legs closed. The brutal self-assessment hung in the air like poison. Richard stared at his wife, trying to reconcile the woman he'd married with the person sitting before him. Someone capable of such betrayal, such cowardice. So you chose to let her stay with her kidnappers rather than face the consequences of what you'd done. I chose to let her stay with people who loved her rather than destroy what little happiness she'd found. Margaret shot back. Helen gave her a good life, Richard. Better than the broken home she would have returned to if she'd come back to us. That wasn't your choice to make, wasn't it? I'm her mother. You gave up the right to call yourself her mother the moment you chose your reputation over her life. Margaret flinched as if he'd slapped her. I was protecting all of us. If Emily had come home, if the truth about why she was taken had come out, the scandal would have destroyed you, destroyed your business, destroyed everything we'd worked for. Richard stood slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than Margaret had ever heard it, and somehow that was more terrifying than his earlier rage. Our daughter has spent 21 years believing her parents didn't love her enough to keep her. 21 years living with the people who stole her childhood. And you let that happen to protect a business deal and save yourself from embarrassment. Richard, pack your things. I want you out of this house by morning. Margaret's facade finally shattered completely. Please, Richard, I know I made mistakes, but we can fix this. We can bring Emily home. We can be a family again. No, Richard said firmly. We can never be a family again. Because family means putting each other first, and you put yourself first, you always have. As Richard walked toward the door, Margaret called after him, desperation making her voice shrill. What are you going to tell Emily about why she was taken? About the affair? Richard paused in the doorway, his back to the woman who'd been his wife, his partner, his greatest mistake. I'm going to tell her the truth, all of it, because that's what she deserves, and it's 21 years overdue. Grace couldn't sleep. For the third night in a row, she lay in her narrow bed staring at the water stain on the ceiling, her mind churning with questions that had no safe answers. Richard Callahan's business card sat on her nightstand like a loaded gun. She'd picked it up a dozen times, even dialed the number twice before hanging up. When you're ready for the truth, call me. The truth. As if truth were some simple thing you could just ask for and receive. Wrapped up neat and clean, Grace had learned early that truth was usually messier than lies, more painful than the comfortable stories people told themselves to sleep at night. At 5 a.m., she gave up on sleep and made coffee in the tiny kitchenette. Through the thin walls, she could hear Mrs. Rodriguez next door getting ready for her factory shift. The same routine that had marked Grace's mornings for the past 6 months. Everything in her life was routine, predictable, safe. So why did she suddenly feel like she was suffocating? Grace pulled out her sketchbook and tried to draw, but her hands wouldn't cooperate. Instead of the careful still lifes that usually calmed her, strange images poured out of her pencil. A golden dog with kind eyes, a fountain with carved angels, a man's hands, strong and gentle, helping a small child count lightning strikes. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. The phantom voice was so real that Grace dropped her pencil and spun around, expecting to find someone behind her, but she was alone in the cramped apartment, surrounded by drawings that felt more like memories than imagination. By the time Helen returned from her overnight shift at the nursing home, Grace had filled 12 pages with fragments of a life she wasn't sure she'd lived. "Morning, sweetheart," Helen said, her voice carrying the forced brightness that had become typical lately. "You're up early. Couldn't sleep." Grace watched her aunt carefully, noting the tension around her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly as she hung up her coat. "Aunt Helen, can I ask you something?" "Of course, baby. What's on your mind?" "Do you ever think about my real parents?" Helen's coffee mug hit the counter harder than necessary. "Grace, honey, why would you want to think about people who hurt you so badly?" "I don't know. It's just, I've been having these dreams, really vivid ones, and yesterday, this man at work." "What man?" Helen's voice sharpened. Grace hesitated. She'd planned to tell Helen about Richard Callahan, about his impossible claims and the photos that looked too much like her. But something in her aunt's expression made her pause. "Just a customer. He said I reminded him of someone. Customers say all sorts of things, Grace. You know that." Helen moved to the window, peering down at the street with unusual interest. "Did this customer, did he ask you any personal questions?" "A few. Why?" "No reason. I just worry about you, that's all. There are strange people in the world. People who might try to take advantage of a sweet girl like you. Grace studied her aunt's profile, noting the rigid set of her shoulders, the way she kept glancing toward the door as if expecting someone to burst through it. "Aunt Helen, are you okay? You seem nervous lately." "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just tired from work." Helen turned back to Grace with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Why don't you tell me about these dreams you've been having?" Grace flipped through her sketchbook to the drawings she'd made that morning. "They're always the same. There's this golden dog, and a fountain, and sometimes there's a man singing to me. Lullabies, I think. But I can't remember the words." Helen went very still. "Grace, you know that children's minds can play tricks on them, especially children who've been through trauma. Sometimes we create false memories to fill in gaps. But what if they're not false?" Grace interrupted. "What if they're real memories that I've been told to forget? Who would tell you to forget your own memories? Someone who had a reason to want me to forget." The question hung between them like a challenge. Helen's face cycled through several emotions before settling on something that looked like resignation. "Grace, there are things about your past that I've protected you from. Painful things, your parents. They weren't good people, sweetheart. They hurt you in ways that a child shouldn't have to remember." "What kind of ways? Does it matter? You're safe now. You're loved. Isn't that enough?" But it wasn't enough. Not anymore. Grace stood and walked to the window, looking down at the street where normal people lived. Normal lives built on normal truths. "I want to see my birth certificate." "What?" "My birth certificate. Social security card? Any documents from before I came to live with you? I've never seen them." Helen's laugh sounded forced. "Honey, those are just pieces of paper. They don't change who you are. Then why won't you show them to me?" "Because they're painful reminders of people who abandoned you. I've kept them locked away to protect you from that hurt." Grace turned back to her aunt, studying the woman who'd raised her with the same careful attention she gave to her drawings. Helen looked older than her 61 years, worn down by something heavier than simple exhaustion. "I met someone yesterday," Grace said quietly. "Someone who thinks I might be his daughter." Helen's face went white. "That's impossible." "Is it? He knew things about me, Aunt Helen. Things that no stranger should know. He knew about dreams I've been having. About images that feel more real than my actual memories." "Grace, listen to me very carefully." Helen's voice took on an urgency Grace had never heard before. "There are bad people in this world who prey on vulnerable young women. People who study missing children cases and use the information to manipulate families who are still grieving." He showed me pictures. "Pictures can be doctored. Stories can be fabricated, sweetheart. This man is probably a con artist looking to exploit a wealthy family's pain." Grace wanted to believe her. It would be so much easier to accept Helen's explanation, to dismiss Richard Callahan as a delusional stranger chasing ghosts. But the age progression photo wouldn't leave her mind. That computer-generated face that could have been her reflection. What if he's telling the truth? Then why hasn't he contacted the police? Why approach you at work instead of going through proper channels? It was a good question, one that Grace hadn't thought to ask. But even as doubt crept in, her mind kept returning to the photo album, to the little girl with amber eyes who looked exactly like her. "I want to call him." "Grace, no. I need to know, Aunt Helen. I need to know if everything I believe about my life is real." Helen crossed the room and took Grace's hands in hers. "Baby girl, you are my whole world. You know that, right? Everything I've done, every choice I've made, has been to protect you and give you a good life. I know that. But I need you to trust me on this. This man, whoever he is, he's going to hurt you. He's going to fill your head with stories about parents who loved you, about a life that was stolen from you. And it's all going to be lies designed to make you doubt the people who actually care about you." Grace looked into Helen's eyes and saw something she'd never noticed before. Fear. Deep, bone-deep terror that went far beyond concern for Grace's well-being. "You're scared," Grace said softly. "Of course I'm scared. I'm scared of losing you to some stranger's fantasy. Or you're scared of me learning the truth." The words slipped out before Grace could stop them. And Helen's reaction confirmed what she'd begun to suspect. Her aunt's face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks as 21 years of carefully constructed lies began to crumble. "Grace, please don't do this." Don't destroy our family because of one man's delusions. But Grace was already reaching for Richard Callahan's business card, her hands steady for the first time in days. Whatever the truth was, painful or liberating, simple or complicated, she deserved to know it. Our family will survive the truth, Aunt Helen, but I don't think I can survive any more lies. As Grace dialed the number, she could hear Helen crying behind her, the sound of a woman whose carefully guarded secret was finally slipping away. And for the first time since Richard Callahan had walked into her life, Grace felt like she could breathe. Richard answered on the first ring, as if he'd been waiting by the phone for days. His voice carried a mix of hope and careful restraint that made Grace's chest tighten. "Grace, I need to know," she said without preamble. "I need to know if what you told me is true. Where are you?" "My apartment." "But I can't do this here. Helen is..." Grace glanced toward the bathroom where Helen had retreated, her sobs still audible through the thin door. "Can you meet me somewhere? Central Park, the Bethesda fountain. Do you know where that is?" Grace's breath caught. The fountain from her locket, the one in Richard's photographs. "Yes, I'll be there in an hour." The subway ride into Manhattan felt like traveling through a tunnel between two different lives. With each stop, Grace felt herself moving further from the safe, predictable world Helen had created, and closer to something that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. She found Richard sitting on a bench facing the fountain, his expensive suit looking out of place among the joggers and dog walkers. When he saw her approaching, he stood with the careful movements of a man trying not to spook a wounded animal. "Thank you for calling," he said quietly. Grace stared at the fountain, recognition hitting her like a physical blow. She'd seen this exact view in dreams, had sketched variations of it dozens of times without understanding why. The carved angels seemed to dance in the afternoon sunlight, just as they had in her childhood memories. "I've been here before," she whispered. "Many times. We used to come every Sunday after church. You'd feed the ducks and climb on the statue until I'd have to chase you down." Grace pulled out her phone and showed him her latest drawing, the fountain rendered in careful detail, complete with the angel's expression that she'd somehow remembered perfectly. "I drew this last night, from memory, but Helen always told me I'd never been to Central Park before I came to live with her." Richard's jaw tightened. "Helen has told you a lot of things that aren't true. She says you're a con artist, someone who studies missing children cases and preys on grieving families. Is that what you think?" Grace studied his face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. Instead, she saw exhaustion and pain that seemed bone deep, the kind of suffering that couldn't be faked. "I don't know what to think anymore. My whole life feels like it's built on quicksand." Richard pulled out his phone and showed her another photo. This one recent, taken with a high-powered telephoto lens. It showed Grace walking to work, but the angle made it clear he'd been watching her for days. "You have been following me." "Yes," he admitted. "I hired investigators the moment I suspected you might be Emily. They've been documenting your routines, your habits, looking for proof. That's terrifying." "I know, and I'm sorry. But Grace, after 21 years of searching, of false leads and dead ends, I had to be sure. I had to know beyond any doubt." He scrolled to another photo, this one showing Grace outside her apartment building, captured in profile as she looked up at something in the sky. "You still do that," Richard said softly. "You always look up when you hear planes. Emily used to say she was watching for guardian angels." The memory hit Grace like lightning. She was 6 years old, standing in a garden, pointing at contrails streaking across a blue sky. A man's voice, warm with amusement. "Those aren't angels, sweetheart. Those are airplanes." Her own tiny voice, indignant. "How do you know they're not angel highways?" "Angel highways," Grace breathed. Richard's eyes filled with tears. "You called them angel highways. You said that's how guardian angels traveled between heaven and earth." Grace's legs gave out, and she sank onto the bench beside him. The memory was so vivid, so real, that it made her current life feel like the fantasy. "This isn't possible. Helen raised me from the time I was 6. She's shown me pictures, told me stories about my childhood with her." "What kind of stories?" "Happy ones. Me learning to read, us moving to different towns for her work, always just the two of us against the world." Grace's voice cracked. She said my parents abandoned me at a foster home, that they couldn't handle having a difficult child. You were never difficult. You were curious, spirited, full of questions about everything but never difficult. Richard pulled out a tablet and opened a video file. This was taken at your 5th birthday party, 6 months before you disappeared. The video showed a backyard garden party with elaborate decorations and dozens of children. But Grace's eyes were immediately drawn to a little girl in a pink tutu, laughing as she chased bubbles across the lawn. The child looked exactly like Grace, but more than that. She moved like Grace, tilted her head like Grace, had the same unconscious grace that made every gesture look like dancing. "That's me," Grace whispered. "Yes, and look, there, by the fountain." The camera panned to show a golden retriever lying in the shade. Panting happily as children petted him, a small girl ran over and threw her arms around the dog's neck, and he licked her face with patient affection. "Thor," Grace said, the name escaping her lips like a prayer. "He died 3 years after you disappeared. I think he was looking for you until the end." Grace was crying now, tears streaming down her face as 21 years of buried memories began clawing their way to the surface. The garden, the dog, the birthday parties, the man who'd sung lullabies and counted lightning strikes. It was all real. "Why?" she asked. "Why would Helen lie to me about everything?" Richard's expression darkened. "Because Helen Whitmore isn't your aunt. She's the sister of Janet Holloway, our former housekeeper. Janet took you to get revenge against my wife." "Revenge for what?" That's complicated. There are things about your mother that you need to know, but tell me." Grace's voice turned hard. 21 years of lies is enough. I want the truth. All of it." Richard hesitated, clearly struggling with how much to reveal. "Your mother was having an affair. Janet caught them together and threatened to tell me, unless Margaret paid her off. Instead, Margaret had Janet fired and blacklisted from other positions. So Janet stole me to hurt my mother. The original plan was temporary. Janet was supposed to bring you back after a few weeks, once the marriage imploded and everyone was too busy with the fallout to ask questions. But Helen," Richard's voice trailed off, "Helen fell in love with me. More than that, she became obsessed. When Janet tried to return you as planned, Helen threatened to turn them both in unless she could keep you permanently." Grace felt sick. The woman who'd raised her, who'd claimed to love her more than anyone else in the world, had been her kidnapper. Every bedtime story, every birthday celebration, every moment of maternal affection had been built on the foundation of a stolen childhood. Where's Janet now? Living in a retirement community in Florida, under an assumed name. My investigators found her last week. Does she know you found me? Not yet. But Grace, there's something else you need to know, Margaret. Your mother. She's known where you were for 15 years. The words hit Grace like a physical blow. What? She hired private investigators after your disappearance. They found you when you were 12, living with Helen in Pennsylvania. But instead of bringing you home, Margaret chose to leave you there. Why? Richard's face twisted with pain and anger. Because she was afraid you'd learn the truth about why you were taken. She was afraid that if you came home, you'd find out about her affair and blame her for your kidnapping. Grace stood abruptly, pacing to the fountain's edge as her world collapsed around her. Not only had she been stolen from her real family, but her birth mother had known where she was and chosen to leave her with her kidnappers. So everyone abandoned me, she said bitterly. Janet took me for revenge. Helen kept me for obsession. And my real mother left me with kidnappers to save her own reputation. I never abandoned you, Richard said quietly. I searched for you every single day for 21 years. I never gave up hope. Grace turned to face him, this stranger who claimed to be her father. But you couldn't find me. No, Helen was smart about hiding you. False documents, constant moves, keeping you isolated from other children who might ask questions. She created Grace Whitmore so thoroughly that Emily Callahan disappeared. And now you get to choose. You can stay Grace Whitmore, with the life Helen built for you, or you can reclaim your identity as Emily Callahan and come home where you belong. Grace stared at the fountain, watching the water dance in patterns that seemed both foreign and familiar. Coming home sounded beautiful in theory, but the reality was more complicated. She was 27 years old, not 6. She had her own life, her own personality, her own relationships, such as they were. What if I don't know how to be Emily anymore? Then we'll figure it out together, one day at a time? Grace's phone buzzed with a text from Helen. Where are you? We need to talk. I'm sorry, baby girl. I'm so sorry. Looking at the message, Grace realized that Helen knew the game was over. After 21 years of carefully constructed lies, the truth was finally forcing its way into the light. I need to go back, Grace said. I need to confront Helen. Grace, if she realizes you know the truth, she's not going to hurt me. Whatever else she is, she loves me, in her own twisted way. She loves me. Richard stood, his expression grim. Love built on lies isn't love, Grace. It's possession. Grace found the apartment empty when she returned. Helen's overnight bag gone from the closet, and her prescription bottles cleared from the bathroom cabinet. A note on the kitchen table, written in Helen's careful script, made Grace's blood run cold. My dearest Grace, by the time you read this, we'll be far away where no one can hurt us anymore. I know you're confused right now, but I promise I can explain everything. Trust me one more time. All my love. Aunt Helen. Grace's hand shook as she called Richard. She's gone. Helen's gone. And she left a note saying we're going somewhere together. But I never agreed to go anywhere. Where are you now? My apartment. But Richard, I think she's coming back for me. The note says, we'll be far away. A sound in the hallway made Grace freeze. Footsteps, measured and familiar, stopping outside her door. Then Helen's voice, strained and urgent. Grace, sweetheart. Open the door. We need to leave now. Grace backed away from the door, the phone still pressed to her ear. She's here, she whispered to Richard. Grace, please. Helen called through the door. I know you're upset, but there are people coming who want to hurt us. We have to go. Don't open that door. Richard's voice was sharp with alarm. I'm calling the police. No police. Helen's voice rose to a shout. Grace, if you let them take me away, you'll never know the truth about your parents, about what really happened to you. Grace hesitated, her hand hovering over the deadbolt. Despite everything, Helen was still the only mother she'd ever known. 21 years of love and protection couldn't be erased by the revelation of how it had all begun. Just talk to me through the door, Grace called back. Tell me the truth. I can't. Not here. They're watching the building, waiting for me to come back. We have maybe 10 minutes before they find us. Who's watching the building? Richard Callahan's people, private investigators, probably police by now. Grace, he's not the loving father he pretends to be. He's a dangerous man who's spent 21 years obsessing over a daughter who's better off without him. Grace pressed her ear to the door, trying to hear if there were other people in the hallway. If that's true, why are you running? Because he has money and power, and I'm just a working woman who saved a little girl from a terrible situation. Who do you think the police are going to believe? Through the phone, Grace could hear Richard's voice. Grace, don't listen to her. She's desperate and dangerous now that her lies are falling apart. Please, baby girl. Helen's voice cracked with emotion. I raised you. I protected you. I love you more than anyone else in this world ever could. Don't let them destroy our family. Grace closed her eyes. Torn between the woman who'd been her anchor for 21 years and the man whose story had awakened memories she'd thought were dreams. Both claimed to love her. Both insisted the other was lying. And Grace was trapped in the middle with no way to know who to trust. A new sound in the hallway made the decision for her. Heavy footsteps, multiple sets, moving with purpose. Helen wasn't lying about being watched. They're here, Helen whispered through the door. Grace, I need you to trust me one more time. There's a fire escape outside your bedroom window. Meet me there in 30 seconds. Grace. No. Richard's voice was urgent through the phone, but Grace was already moving. Muscle memory from years of Helen's paranoid safety drills taking over. Helen had always prepared for the possibility that they'd need to run, had practiced escape routes from every apartment they'd ever lived in. At the time, Grace had thought it was Helen's way of dealing with anxiety about her abusive ex-husband. Another lie, apparently. Grace climbed out onto the fire escape just as Helen appeared on the landing below, breathing hard and clutching a small suitcase. This way, Helen whispered, leading Grace down the metal stairs to the alley behind the building. A nondescript sedan waited in the shadows, engine running. Helen had planned this carefully, had probably been planning it since the moment Grace first mentioned Richard Callahan. "Get in," Helen said, opening the passenger door. Grace hesitated, her phone still connected to Richard. She could hear him calling her name, could hear other voices in the background. Police, maybe, or the investigators Helen had mentioned. "Grace, please. I know you're scared and confused, but I'm the only family you have left. I'm the only one who's never lied to you. You've done nothing but lie to me. I protected you from painful truths. There's a difference." Helen's eyes filled with tears. "Your real parents, Grace. They're not the people Richard pretends they are. Your mother is a drunk and a pill addict who cared more about her social status than her own daughter. Your father is a workaholic who turned you into an obsession after you disappeared because he couldn't handle the guilt of being a terrible parent. That's not true, isn't it? In 21 years, did either of them ever try to contact you directly? Ever try to have a relationship with the woman you became instead of mourning the child they lost?" The question hit harder than Grace expected. Richard had been watching her, investigating her, but he'd never simply approached her as himself. He'd hidden behind business meetings and carefully orchestrated encounters, treating her like a puzzle to be solved rather than a person to be known. "They want Emily back," Helen continued. "The perfect little 6-year-old who never grew up, never developed her own personality, never became inconveniently independent. They don't want Grace, the woman I helped you become." Grace climbed into the passenger seat, her mind reeling. Helen started the car immediately, pulling out of the alley as police sirens wailed in the distance. "Where are we going?" "Canada. I have a friend there, someone who can help us start over again. New identities, new lives, away from all this madness." Grace stared out the window as Queens flashed past, everything familiar and safe disappearing behind them. "You've done this before." "What do you mean? New identities? You have experience with this kind of thing?" Helen's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "I've always been prepared for the possibility that we'd need to disappear. I learned early that sometimes running is the only way to protect the people you love." They were on the highway now, heading north. Grace tried to call Richard back, but her phone had no signal. Helen had probably installed a jamming device in the car. "You can't keep running forever," Grace said quietly. "I can try, for you. I can try anything. But what kind of life is that? Always looking over our shoulders, never staying anywhere long enough to build real relationships, never being able to trust anyone. It's better than the alternative." "Which is what?" Helen's voice broke. "Losing you, having you realize that the woman who raised you is a kidnapper and a liar, watching you choose strangers over the person who's loved you most." Grace studied Helen's profile, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time. Behind the careful makeup and practiced composure was a woman driven by desperate loneliness. Someone who'd convinced herself that love justified any action, no matter how destructive. "I need you to pull over," Grace said. "We can't stop yet." "Pull over, Helen, please." Helen reluctantly guided the car to a rest stop, her hands shaking as she turned off the engine. "Grace, I know this is overwhelming, but once we get to Canada..." "I'm not going to Canada." "What?" "I'm not running anymore. I'm tired of living in fear, tired of half-truths and hidden documents and fake identities." Grace turned to face Helen fully. "I need to know who I really am, and I can't do that if we keep running from the past. You're Grace Whitmore. You're my daughter in every way that matters." "No," Grace said gently. "I'm Emily Callahan, and I was stolen from my family when I was 6 years old. And you, Helen Whitmore, are the woman who helped steal me." Helen's careful composure finally shattered. She collapsed over the steering wheel, sobbing with 21 years of suppressed guilt and terror. "I never meant for it to go this far," she cried. "It was supposed to be temporary. Janet was just so angry and I was so lonely. And when she brought you to me, God, Grace, you were so small and scared and beautiful. I fell in love with you instantly. So you kept me. I saved you from parents who were too busy destroying each other to notice their own daughter. From a house full of lies and betrayal and pain, I gave you love, stability, a mother who put you first always." Grace reached over and took Helen's hand. "I know you love me, but love isn't supposed to be built on lies and theft and fear. Real love means wanting what's best for the person you love, even if it means letting them go." Through the windshield, Grace could see police cars appearing on the horizon, their red and blue lights cutting through the gathering dusk. Richard had found them, just as she'd known he would. "I can't let them take you away from me," Helen whispered. "You're not losing me," Grace said softly. "You're finally setting me free." The police cars surrounded them within minutes, their strobing lights turning the rest stop into a surreal carnival of red and blue. Grace watched through the windshield as officers took positions behind their vehicles, hands resting on their weapons. "This is Detective Morrison, NYPD," a voice boomed through a megaphone. "Step out of the vehicle with your hands visible." Helen's grip on the steering wheel was so tight her knuckles had gone white. "I can't go to prison." "Grace, I can't survive that. You won't have to survive it alone," Grace said gently. "I'll visit you. I'll write letters. You'll always be part of my life, Helen. Just honestly this time. You don't understand. I'm 61 years old. A kidnapping conviction. I'll die in prison." Grace saw the moment Helen made her decision. It was subtle. A shift in her posture, a settling of her shoulders. A look that Grace had seen before during their midnight moves between cities. The look of someone who'd rather run toward disaster than face the consequences of her choices. "Helen, don't..." But Helen was already starting the engine, her foot slamming down on the accelerator. The car lurched forward, tires squealing against asphalt as they shot past the police barricade. "Helen, stop!" Grace grabbed for the steering wheel, but Helen pushed her away with surprising strength. "I won't let them take you from me. I won't." The car careened onto the highway, Helen driving with reckless desperation as police sirens wailed behind them. Grace fumbled for her seatbelt, her heart hammering as they weaved between cars at dangerous speeds. "This isn't going to work," Grace shouted over the engine noise. "They'll catch us, and then everything will be worse." "No, they won't. I know these roads. I've been planning escape routes for 21 years. Helen took an exit ramp so fast, the car went up on 2 wheels before crashing back down. Grace's head struck the passenger window, stars exploding across her vision. When her sight cleared, she saw they were heading toward the Brooklyn Bridge, its towers looming against the darkening sky. Behind them, the police convoy was gaining ground, their more powerful engines and professional training making up for Helen's head start. Grace could see Richard's BMW among the pursuing vehicles, and even through the chaos, the sight of him brought an unexpected sense of relief. "Helen, please," Grace tried once more. "Let's stop this before someone gets hurt." "Someone's already been hurt." Helen's voice was raw with anguish. "You've been hurt, Grace. You've been living a lie for 21 years, and now they want to take away the only love you've ever known and replace it with strangers who abandoned you once already. They didn't abandon me. Your mother knew where you were for 15 years. 15 years, Grace. And she chose to leave you with me rather than bring you home. What does that tell you about how much they really wanted you back?" The words hit like physical blows, each one designed to undermine Grace's fragile new understanding of her identity. But even as doubt crept in, Grace held on to one truth. Richard had never stopped searching. Whatever Margaret's failures, Richard had never given up. They were on the bridge now, the East River flowing dark and treacherous below them. Helen was driving erratically, her emotions overriding her survival instincts. Grace could feel the car swaying dangerously with each turn. "Helen, slow down, please. I gave you everything," Helen sobbed, tears streaming down her face. "I gave you my whole life. Every choice I made was for you. Every lie I told was to protect you. And now you're going to throw it all away for people who couldn't even be bothered to find you." Richard found me. After 21 years. Where was he when you were learning to read? When you had nightmares? When you needed someone to hold you and tell you everything would be okay? Grace had no answer for that. Helen had been there for all those moments, had been the steady presence that made Grace feel safe and loved. The fact that it was all built on deception didn't erase the genuine care Helen had provided. "I know you loved me," Grace said quietly. "But Helen, the way you loved me was wrong. You can't build happiness on someone else's pain." "I was in pain too," Helen's voice cracked. "I was 40 years old and barren and alone. And then Janet brought me this beautiful, broken little girl who needed a mother, I thought. I was saving both of us." The car hit a patch of ice. October in New York could be unpredictable, and Helen lost control. Grace watched in horror as the steering wheel spun uselessly in Helen's hands, the car sliding sideways across 2 lanes of traffic. Time seemed to slow down. Grace could see individual raindrops on the windshield, could count the worried faces of drivers swerving to avoid them, could hear Helen's sharp intake of breath as she realized what was happening. The car struck the bridge's concrete barrier with a grinding shriek of metal against stone. The impact threw Grace against the passenger door, but her seatbelt held. Helen, who hadn't been wearing hers, was thrown forward into the steering wheel. Steam rose from the crumpled hood as Grace struggled to orient herself. Her left arm throbbed, probably sprained, and there was blood on her forehead, but she was alive. Helen, Grace turned to check on her aunt and felt her heart stop. Helen was slumped over the steering wheel, a thin line of blood trickling from the corner of her mouth. Her eyes were open but unfocused, and when Grace touched her shoulder, there was no response. Helen. Grace shook her gently, then more urgently. Helen, wake up. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder. Grace could see police cars and an ambulance racing toward them, but everything felt distant and unreal. The woman who had raised her, who had shaped every aspect of her identity for 21 years, was dying in the seat beside her. I'm sorry, Grace whispered, though she wasn't sure if Helen could hear her. I'm sorry you were so lonely. I'm sorry Janet hurt you. I'm sorry I couldn't be enough to heal whatever was broken inside you. Helen's lips moved slightly, forming words that Grace had to lean close to hear. Love, you, always. Grace was crying now, tears mixing with the blood on her face. I love you too. Despite everything, I love you too. By the time the paramedics reached the car, Helen Whitmore was gone. Grace watched numbly as they worked over her aunt's body, performing CPR with professional efficiency even though they all knew it was too late. Richard appeared at the passenger door, his face white with terror. Grace, are you hurt? She's dead, Grace said simply. Helen's dead. Richard helped her out of the wreckage, his hands gentle as he guided her to a waiting ambulance. Grace looked back once at the crumpled car and the woman who had been her whole world for 21 years. She loved me, Grace said to Richard as the paramedics checked her injuries. She kidnapped me and lied to me and stole my childhood, but she loved me. I know, Richard said quietly. That's what makes this so tragic. As the ambulance carried Grace toward the hospital, she stared out the rear window at the scene of the accident. Helen's body was being loaded into a coroner's van. The woman who had called herself Grace's aunt, about to become another casualty of a crime that had started with revenge and ended with desperate love. Grace closed her eyes and tried to remember her real mother's face, tried to imagine what it would be like to go home to a family she didn't remember. But all she could see was Helen, teaching her to read, braiding her hair, singing lullabies in the dark. The only mother she'd ever known was gone, and Grace Whitmore was about to discover what it really meant to be Emily Callahan. 3 months later, the morning sun filtered through the windows of Dr. Sarah Chen's office, casting long shadows across the comfortable chairs where Grace, she was learning to think of herself as Emily again, sat with Richard for their weekly family therapy session. How are you feeling about the visit to Helen's grave yesterday, Dr. Chen asked gently. Emily touched the small gardenia pin on her jacket lapel, a gift from Richard to honor both Helen's memory and Emily's complicated feelings about the woman who had raised her. Peaceful, I think, for the first time since the accident. I felt settled. The past 3 months had been a whirlwind of legal proceedings, media attention, and painful adjustments. Janet Holloway had died in her Florida retirement home just days after Helen's accident. Her final act, a handwritten confession that provided closure to one of the country's most famous cold cases. Margaret had been sentenced to 2 years in minimum security prison for obstruction of justice and conspiracy. After the fact, a lenient sentence negotiated by expensive lawyers and her cooperation with authorities, Emily had attended the sentencing, sitting in the gallery as the woman who had given birth to her was led away in handcuffs. Margaret had looked older, diminished. Her perfectly styled facade finally cracked beyond repair. Their eyes had met briefly, and Emily had seen regret there, along with a desperate hope for forgiveness that Emily wasn't ready to offer yet. The hardest part, Emily continued, is accepting that all of it was real. Helen's love for me, her sacrifices, the way she put my needs first in so many ways. That was genuine. Even though it started with such a terrible lie. Richard shifted in his chair, still uncomfortable with praise for the woman who had stolen his daughter. Over the past months, Emily had watched him struggle with his own complex emotions. Relief at having her back, rage at the lost years, guilt over the circumstances that had led to her kidnapping. "It's okay to mourn her," Dr. Chen said. "Grief doesn't follow logical rules. You can grieve the loss of Helen while also being angry about what she did to you. I visited Margaret last week," Emily said quietly. Watching Richard's reaction, his jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't object. Their relationship was still fragile, built on careful honesty and Dr. Chen's mediation. Emily was learning to be someone's daughter again, while Richard was learning to love the woman Emily had become, rather than mourning the child Emily had been. How did that go? Difficult. She's broken. The pills, the alcohol, the guilt. It's eaten her alive. She kept apologizing, kept saying she wanted to protect me from the truth about why I was taken. Do you believe her? Emily considered the question. I think she convinced herself she was protecting me, but really, she was protecting herself from having to face what her choices had cost our family. Richard reached over and squeezed Emily's hand. You don't have to forgive her. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I know. But I think I want to try. Not for her sake, but for mine. I don't want to carry that anger forever. Dr. Chen made a note. And how are things going with rebuilding your relationship with your father? Emily smiled, the expression coming more naturally now. Better. We're learning each other slowly. He's teaching me about the business world, and I'm teaching him about art. We discovered we both loved terrible action movies and Thai food. It was true. The past months had been full of small discoveries and gradual connections. Richard had moved Emily into the guest wing of his penthouse, giving her space to adjust while remaining close enough to rebuild their bond. He'd shown her Emily's preserved bedroom, exactly as it had been when she was 6, but hadn't pressured her to move into it. Emily appreciated the gesture while understanding that she could never go back to being that little girl. Instead, they were creating something new. Richard had enrolled her in art classes at a prestigious Manhattan studio, funding her education without expectation of return. Emily was discovering that her artistic talent, nurtured secretly during all those years with Helen, had real potential for growth. The media attention is finally dying down, Richard added. I've hired a security company to handle the last few reporters, and our attorney thinks the book deal offers will taper off soon. Emily nodded. The story of the kidnapped heiress who'd been found working as a waitress had captivated the public imagination for weeks. Publishers, movie producers, and talk show hosts had all clamored for exclusive rights to her story, but Emily had declined them all, choosing privacy over profit as she rebuilt her life. There's something else, Emily said, pulling a letter from her purse. I got this yesterday. The envelope was addressed to Grace Whitmore, care of Richard's attorney. Inside was a handwritten note from Maria, the head waitress at Le Bernardin. She says they'd like to name a scholarship in Helen's memory, Emily explained. For young women from difficult backgrounds who want to pursue careers in hospitality, she thought I might want to contribute to it. Richard's expression softened. That's a beautiful gesture. I want to do it. I want to fund the whole thing, actually. Helen made mistakes. Terrible, life-altering mistakes. But she also showed me what it meant to work hard and care for people. Maybe this way, some good can come from all the pain. Dr. Chen smiled. That sounds like a very healthy way to honor your complicated feelings about Helen. Emily folded the letter carefully. I'm also thinking about changing my name legally, not back to Emily Callahan. That little girl is gone, but maybe Emily Grace Callahan, to acknowledge both parts of who I am. I think that's perfect, Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. And there's one more thing. Emily pulled out a small velvet box. I want to return this to you. Inside was the broken gold locket that had started everything, the tiny photograph that had revealed Emily's identity and shattered Helen's carefully constructed lies. Helen gave this to me when I was 12, Emily explained. She said it was a picture of my parents from before they abandoned me. She used it to fuel my anger toward you, to make me grateful for her love instead of longing for yours. Richard took the locket with trembling hands. She kept a picture of us all those years. I think somewhere deep down, Helen always knew she'd have to give me back eventually. Maybe the locket was her way of keeping that possibility alive, even while she was running from it. Emily stood and walked to the window, looking out at Central Park where she and Richard had met that pivotal day at Bethesda Fountain. The trees were dressed in autumn colors, golden and red leaves dancing in the October breeze. "I went back to the fountain yesterday after visiting Helen's grave," she said. "I threw a penny in and made a wish, just like I used to when I was little." "What did you wish for?" Richard asked. Emily turned back to them, her amber eyes, so much like his mother's, bright with tears and hope. "I wished for the courage to keep building this new life, one honest relationship at a time. I wished for Helen to find peace wherever she is, and I wished for our family, broken and complicated as it is, to keep healing." Outside, storm clouds gathered over Manhattan, but Emily no longer feared the thunder. She had learned that some storms brought destruction, but others brought the rain that helped new things grow. As she sat back down beside her father, Emily Grace Callahan felt ready to embrace whatever weather came next, secure in the knowledge that she finally knew who she was and where she belonged. For the first time in 21 years, she was truly home.